Welcome back to the channel, everybody. This is Han of Han Talks First. Yesterday, we looked at the original script of Return of the Jedi and George Lucas's process about coming up with a good ending. And today, we're going behind the scenes of the rest of the production. And if you haven't seen part 1, click the link in this video so you can be all caught up. Let's get started by talking about the series of story conferences between the creators. You're listening to Han Talks First.
So who talks first? You talk first? I talk first.
A series of story conferences involved discussions with George Lucas, Lawrence Kasdan, Richard Marquand, and Howard Kasdan. Now, Richard is the director of Return of the Jedi, Lawrence Kasdan is one of the writers, and Howard is the producer on Return of the Jedi. So Lawrence Kasdan and George Lucas clashed repeatedly through these sessions of the story conferences because Lawrence was trying to push for a darker story and a more adult direction, but George Lucas continually pulled back on it. Because George Lucas started becoming, he pulled back on it so much and he was so frustrated with Lawrence that he eventually started to become very sarcastic with him. At one point, he actually jokingly suggested that at the end of the film, he should have Luke put on Vader's mask, destroy the rebel fleet, and proclaim himself as the new emperor. Now, Lawrence Kasdan actually took his tone as serious, not sarcastic, and he replied to him saying, "I think that's what should happen too." Isn't that just very odd that that's how Lawrence Kasdan wanted this to end? Well, we'll talk more about it, but I think it was funny how he took a sarcastic comment from George and wanted to make it a reality. Now, Lawrence Kasdan argued at length that the Jedi should feature, Return of the Jedi should feature a death of a major character. And at first, he actually suggested Luke be killed in a battle, and that Leia would become the one who finishes off the Emperor. George Lucas quickly vetoed that idea, and Lawrence Kasdan also suggested, well, why don't we just kill Han Solo? But again, Lucas, denied that as well, and he insisted that the viewers would feel let down if Han and Leia didn't end up together at the end of the film. He also suggested that Lando be vaporized. Not just vaporized, but also along with the Falcon. During the final battle scene, Lando and the Millennium Falcon would both be destroyed. And his quote backing that up is, "I'm trying to give the story some kind of edge to it." George Lucas obviously, vetoed that as well. He didn't like the idea of any of the main characters being killed off in this final film. And honestly, thinking about it now, if they'd have destroyed the Falcon, that would have made for a very, very interesting, future for Star Wars, since it's one of the most iconic ships, and it's practically in every Star Wars movie, TV show that's out there, so that is very interesting. But ultimately, George Lucas remained adamant that, and I quote, "Everybody needs to live happily ever after, and nothing bad happens to anybody. The whole emotion I'm trying to get at the end of this film is for you to be really uplifted emotionally and spiritually, and feel absolutely good about life. And that is the greatest thing that we could possibly ever do." So that's a quote from George Lucas about his overall tone of the ending chapter to this trilogy. Eventually, he did agree on a death, and the one death that he agreed to was Master Yoda. But he proclaimed that he could not die in a battle, and George insisted that he died of old age in a life-affirming way, to demonstrate that death was a natural part of the Force, and something that shouldn't be feared. Some other things that Lawrence Kasdan was, very against in George Lucas's first draft, because you gotta remember, George Lucas alone wrote the first draft of Return of the Jedi. And then he came to Lawrence Kasdan and said, let's clean it up a little bit. Now, one thing that Lawrence Kasdan was very much against was the Ewoks, or at least in this first draft, they were known as the Ewax. I love Ewoks better. Ewax sounds a little provocative, but, whatever. And he wanted to base this off of Apocalypse Now. George Lucas did. The whole role of the Ewoks in the film, and the idea of this low-tech indigenous people overcoming a technologically superior military force such as the Empire. So that was kind of George Lucas's homage to Apocalypse Now, who was made by one of his great friends, Francis Ford Coppola. And another thing Lawrence Kasdan didn't want in this script was he didn't want another Death Star, let alone two. In George Lucas's first draft, he wanted 2 new Death Stars, and Lawrence Kasdan was very much against it, and ultimately, he was able to convince him to get rid of one of them. But Lucas's defense to keeping a Death Star was his very famous quote about, well, Star Wars is like poetry. It rhymes. He's been saying that since the 70s about these Star Wars movies. And so that's why he wanted to keep the Death Star in there. But George Lucas insisted that Luke must return to Yoda at some point in this film because he had empathetically promised to do so in Empire Strikes Back, and he thought that would disappoint fans. Another thing that Lawrence Kasdan, didn't want from George Lucas as a first official draft was he didn't want Vader to be redeemed at all. At all. He wanted Vader to die a villain. And he quotes saying, the redemption that George wrote for him makes Vader look wimpy. And you can see how much these guys butted heads during the making of this last film. But this also is a testament to George Lucas and his collaborative efforts, because this was his project. He could have cut out Lawrence as whenever he wanted to, but he let him stay around because he was keeping him level-headed and helping him not get too carried away with some of his ideas. Now, the way that George Lucas convinced Lawrence Kasdan to be okay with Vader's redemption was that Lawrence insisted that his unmasked face look hideously scarred and mangled. And George Lucas was okay with that. And that, of course, is when the idea of Vader being, destroyed on Mustafar came to life. Since they couldn't have the lava in Return of the Jedi, he decided to create somewhat of a backstory where him and Obi-Wan fought, and eventually Obi-Wan got the high ground and destroyed Vader, and he caught fire, and which ultimately became Revenge of the Sith. But this is where that idea came from. And it wasn't just Lawrence Kasdan who actually got to give input on the story. George Lucas actually took input from the 3 main stars, Mark and Harrison and Carrie, which is actually kind of impressive that George would go out of his way to see what his actors wanted to see happen in this third film. Some original ideas from Mark Hamill was that he wanted Luke to give into the dark side and use its power to destroy Vader and the Emperor, but then he would go back to the good side because of Leia. And we kind of got a little bit of that. I mean, at least ironically and metaphorically, symbolically, with the black robes and all that kind of stuff, and the way he fought Vader at the end. One of the ideas that Harrison suggested, again, was that he wanted to, commit a self-sacrifice and ultimately be destroyed. He really wanted his character to die. He felt like that was the perfect purpose that he could have to contribute to the Star Wars story. And one of the things that Carrie had suggested she wanted to see in the story was she wanted to soften the character of Leia, because she complained that before, and I quote here, she came off as some kind of space bitch. That sounds like Carrie Fisher, doesn't it? Gotta love Carrie. We did see a softening of Leia. She got less, smack talky and back talky, less insults, scruffy looking nerf herder. And it makes sense considering, the arc of her character. But I do miss that old Princess Leia, the classic Princess Leia. So moving on to the second draft of the story. By the time this second draft was completed and he took all the, words of inspiration and input from the cast and the writer, he completed the script and he turned it in on September 21st, 1981. However, the only passages that were left blank were the major battle scenes, which Lucas was designing with his team back at ILM. And Lucas then filled in those blanks and gave the script back to Lawrence Kasdan, and then Lawrence Kasdan polished up those scenes, revised it, and made it become the shooting script. And the shooting script was delivered on December 1st, 1981. So really, it took just about a year for the script to be fully realized. Now, everything that was in the script wasn't really set in stone because George Lucas continued making adjustments and writing new things as they were in production and shooting some of the scenes. What's very interesting was the last thing that was written for Return of the Jedi was the final dialogue for Luke and Vader and the Emperor during the final scenes of this film, which was actually all 100% written by George Lucas. He had no assistance from Lawrence Kasdan on writing the ending of the movie, at least in that climactic battle, which I believe is some of the most well-written Star Wars we have ever seen. Some of the most well-written scene that I've ever seen in a movie before. So it's very impressive to that. You know, George Lucas, he's a good writer, and I think the reason why this is so good is because he waited and did it last minute when they were in the moment, actually shooting this movie, and he could really, you know, be in the minds of these characters, and it was kind of just like a passion of the moment thing. Now, one of the big questions about the making of Return of the Jedi was, how did they keep this movie such a secret? Was George Lucas and Lawrence Kasdan actually wrote additional scenes for this movie once they knew that they would never actually appear on the screen? And as a part of the Star Wars team's extraordinary efforts to ensure secrecy of the movie, they would write fake scenes, and the fake scenes were written to substitute those, for example, in which Obi-Wan Kenobi reveals Leia's true relationship to Luke, and another one is which the Emperor and Vader die. And in these fake scenes, or these phony scenes, as George Lucas calls them, Luke, rather than Vader, kills the Emperor. And the real script for these scenes were printed on blue paper and was withheld from a majority of the cast and the crew, and often withheld until the final moments leading up to their shooting schedule. So the script ended up answering all those lingering questions from The Empire Strikes Back, but often in the least imaginative way as possible. George Lucas knew this, and he explained once in an interview that Star Wars started off as a simple fairy tale, and that's all it really is. When Return of the Jedi comes out, people will say, "Oh my god, how obvious. Why couldn't they think of something more interesting than that?" And honestly, the truth is, they did think of some things more interesting than the final outcome of this movie. They just happened to be rejected. And I think the final film that we got of Return of the Jedi is the perfect ending to this story. And that is it for the making of Return of the Jedi. If you haven't seen my videos on the making of A New Hope or the making of Empire Strikes Back, those are linked down below. I hope you enjoyed today's video, and tomorrow be sure to come back to the channel and listen to my interview with Hollywood screenwriter Cameron Pasha. We're going to be talking all about Star Wars and screenwriting, and I think you're going to enjoy it a whole lot. But until then, tell me your favorite scene from Return of the Jedi in the comments section below, and please leave a like on this video so we can get some buzz. And now, my friends, somehow, someway, somewhere this week, may the Force be with you.